Welcome to the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. After learning a ton about kidney stones and helping people prevent stones at the University of Chicago, I was fed up with all the terrible advice people were finding online. So I decided to do something about it. The Kidney Dietitian was born. This podcast is for people who want to learn what actually works to prevent kidney stones and still enjoy life, eating, and their favorite foods. Let's dive in. Hello and welcome to the 134th episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. As always, I'm your host, registered dietitian and kidney stone expert, Melanie Betts. And this week I wanted to tackle a question that I get all the time. I'm thinking it honestly might be the most common question that I get from kidney stone nutrition school students, as well as people from Instagram and Facebook and email and all of the different ways that I talk to people. And that is that how much calcium, the question is, how much calcium do I need to eat to offset some specific amount of oxalate, right? So many people are so focused on oxalate, right? Then we learn that, oh, okay, cool. That calcium can sort of like neutralize or reduce the absorption, is more accurate, of oxalate from the healthy foods that we eat. Well, how much calcium do I need to eat? And the answer is there's no specific ratio, and we really need to zoom out, and I'll talk more about that at the end of the podcast. But there's no specific ratio that I can give you that if you eat this amount of oxalate, you need to consume this amount of calcium to balance it, right? And there's a couple of reasons why that is. First of all, the data just isn't advanced enough, right? There's no study that really dives into this question specifically. So that's one. But also, it really would be kind of a silly question to ask in general because there are so many different variables that would just be impossible to account for, right? So first of all, oxalate exists in two different forms. There is insoluble and soluble oxalate. And it is, as I'm about to talk about, it's impossible to know exactly how much oxalate total you're consuming when you consume a meal or a snack or any food. But it's even more impossible to know exactly how much insoluble versus soluble oxalate you're consuming. And honestly, the insoluble stuff doesn't really matter because you're really not going to that stuff isn't going to end up in your urine like soluble oxalate does. And so it's really soluble oxalate is really the only type of oxalate that we care about. And we truly do not know how much is in those two different foods, right? So it doesn't really make any sense for us to say like we need to consume this amount of calcium or this amount of oxalate because oxalate just exists in so many different types of forms, essentially. Also, the right amount of calcium that's going to be exactly right for that specific food is going to very, very much on the other components of that food. Is there fiber in that food? Is there calcium in that food already, right? Is there other prebiotic fibers that might help impact the gut microbiome? Is there magnesium? Is there there's so many factors that are sort of playing together here. That's why it doesn't really make sense to be thinking about this question so granularly. If I eat this amount of this food that has this oxalate in it, I need to consume this much calcium. Also, there's going to be huge differences based on the person, based on their gut microbiome, as well as probably tons of other factors, right? Because those gut bacteria, I know we talk about the gut microbiome as this like fun thing to talk about, but truly there are more gut bacteria than cells in the rest of your body. Like, it's astounding how many bacteria are down there, and the effects that they have on questions like this one is huge. And so there would be no way to even begin to account for the differences in the gut microbiome. So for all of those reasons, it does not make any sense for me to even really ask that question from a research standpoint of how much calcium do I need to eat to neutralize or reduce the absorption of this much oxalate, because there's going to be so many factors that would not make sense. It would be impossible to account for those in sort of a real life situation, which is you sitting down to eat your dinner and wanting to know how much calcium to eat, right? Also, I think perhaps the even more important factor to consider is that it is impossible for us to know how much total oxalate we're consuming anyway. Never, not even thinking about the insoluble versus soluble forms. It is impossible to know exactly how much oxalate you're consuming because, yes, we talk about the Harvard oxalate list and we talk about how that's sort of the gold standard, and that certainly is true. However, there are huge differences in oxalate content, just like many nutrients, honestly, but oxalate is especially variable across different species, and it's especially susceptible to differences in terms of like the soil. So what I'm trying to say is an apple is not an apple, right? An apple can have very, very different amounts of oxalate. And so when we say on, say, the Harvard Oxalate list that an apple has whatever it says, right, however many milligrams of oxalate, that was true for the apple that they tested at that one time, but that apple would be very different if it was grown in Michigan versus Washington. It would be very different based on when you harvested that apple, right? Was it in the prime or not so prime? How long ago did you harvest that apple? How did you cook that apple, right? Or did you cook it at all? Did you eat the skin, right? There's like literally hundreds of different factors that play into exactly how much oxalate you're consuming, that it is impossible to exactly know how much oxalate you are consuming. Not to mention, right, we know the Harvard Oxalate list is generally considered to be one of the best, but that oxalate list only has, I'm going to guess, 150 foods, maybe a little more, because the updated one does have some more. And that's great. I'm glad that they expanded it. However, that obviously does not account for every single food that you ever want to eat, especially when we start thinking about things like crackers or a veggie burger, right, or something that isn't sort of like a whole food that was tested. It is impossible to know how much oxalate is in those crackers or in that slice of bread, in the brand of bread that you buy. You do not know, right? And that's okay. I promise I'm going to end this episode on a good note, and hopefully I'll convince you that it doesn't really matter that you don't know exactly how much oxalate you're consuming. We just don't know, right? And not to mention, right, the Harvard Oxalate list is wonderful if you consume a diet that is sort of your average American diet, because those are the foods that they focused on. But what if you are from Nigeria, right? There's all sorts of foods that people eat in Africa and other parts of the country that are not even on that list. So I also feel like there's something to be said for sort of the bias in the foods that we tested. And yes, you could spend endless hours going to the research and trying to find exactly how much oxalate is in all these different foods, but it's very difficult, because a lot of the ways apparently that they tested oxalate years ago wasn't accurate, because it's apparently very difficult to test. This is getting a little bit outside of my expertise, but essentially the measuring oxalate is especially difficult, and whatever they did to measure it in the past wasn't accurate, which resulted in a ton of very inaccurate oxalate content information floating around the internet and from very reputable sources and lists, which means that even if you Google something, it's very likely to not be accurate, even if in terms of like measuring that apple at that one point in time, right? So all that being said, there are so many factors that come into how much oxalate is in that plate of food that's in front of you at that time, and it is literally impossible to know how much oxalate you are eating, which is one of the many reasons I do not recommend a specific oxalate amount per day. There simply is nothing mentioned in the guidelines for a lot of the reasons that I just mentioned. Plus, it's so different for each person. So And I think when you begin to try to figure out how much oxalate you consume, it kind of sends you down this pretty scary wild goose chase, right? Because you just kind of become obsessive, because I think there's a lot of reasons why, but I think a lot of it is because it's so difficult, and you just kind of become scared, right? Can I eat this? And you sort of end up restricting your food to only those safe foods that you know how much oxalate is in. And that's just like totally unnecessary and potentially harmful, right? Both from a nutrition variety standpoint as well as a mental health standpoint, as if you feel like you can't branch out and eat foods that you aren't on this piece of paper, right? So that's one of many reasons why I don't recommend a specific oxalate amount per day. So what do you do, right? So hopefully I've convinced you that thinking about it in this granularly of way doesn't make any sense. And yes, I think it is important to generally eat the calcium that you eat when you are eating other foods, because hopefully your meals and snacks contain foods that have oxalate in them, because healthy foods contain oxalate, right? So hopefully you are eating fruits and vegetables and whole grains and nuts and seeds. And instead of thinking about, okay, like I had this food that's quote high oxalate, because again, it's really hard to define and who knows if that's the case anyway. Instead of thinking it like that, instead just try to get in a serving of calcium, a high calcium food whenever you consume your meals. Because the recommendation for calcium for people who have calcium oxalate kidney stones, or any sort of calcium based stone, who have high levels levels of calcium in their urine, or who have high oxalate levels in their urine, is somewhere between 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day. Now, so instead of this, think about it like that, right? Think about it from this big picture, like daily goal, not how much you should consume with each food. And if you are consuming 2 to 3 servings of dairy a day, I can basically guarantee that you are getting in those 3 servings, or you're getting in that calcium, right? Because when you consider how much calcium is in a glass of milk, for example, it's going to be like 250-ish milligrams of calcium. And then when you multiply that by 3 plus the little bits of calcium that are going to be in all the other foods that you're consuming, like it's basically guaranteed that you're getting in that 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day. So I don't care what you're eating. If you have worked with a dietitian and you have identified that getting an adequate calcium is an important thing for you to prevent kidney stones, then it is important to eat that calcium with your meals to help generally reduce the oxalate that's generally going to be in all the foods that you consume, right? It doesn't matter if it's high or low. We need that calcium anyway. It's so important for our bones, because we know that people with calcium oxalate stones, or calcium, any type of calcium stone again, are at higher risk of bone disease. And so we really it's super important for you to get in that calcium generally. And generally, your foods should have oxalate in it because these are healthy foods, right? A totally oxalate-free or a super low oxalate diet is not a healthy diet for kidney stones or general health, right? And so instead of thinking about it, like stressing about it, like I'm all about reducing that stress, looking at the big picture here, the Kidney Dietitian, right? Instead of thinking about it like that, just think about, okay, I'm going to eat a healthy, varied diet that includes lots of plant foods. I know that there's oxalate in there, but that's okay because I know that I'm getting in enough calcium that is going to help offset that. And that one step alone is enough to reduce urine oxalate levels to safe values if they were even high in the first place. Most people with calcium oxalate stones don't even have high urine oxalate to begin with. But even if you did, in my experience, probably 90% of the time we can get urine oxalate levels down by just doing this, by just simply getting an adequate calcium. And I will also note that 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams of calcium per day is not a high calcium goal. This is like literally what all of us should be doing anyway. It's the RDA. It's the recommended dietary allowance of calcium that people need to stay healthy, right? And so it's not that we're recommending a high calcium diet. It's just that it's extra important for you as a calcium stone former to get in that calcium to help reduce the oxalate that gets absorbed into your body, right? And also it's extra important for you because you are at higher risk of bone disease, things like fractures, osteoporosis, osteopenia, etc. Also, I always like to kind of highlight the differences, right? Because there is no one kidney stone diet. It's so important for us to even look at the type of stone that you have. I would probably argue that anyone with a calcium-based stone should probably be thinking about how much calcium they're consuming and making sure they're getting in enough because of that bone health standpoint, right? But if you have calcium phosphate stones and oxalate isn't a concern for you whatsoever, then it probably isn't as important for you to really time it with meals. Because again, that oxalate isn't really a big driver of stone formation for you. So I don't really care when you get in that calcium. I just want to make sure you get it in to help protect your bones, right? But if you have uric acid stones, if you're a cysteine stone form, if you have a struvite stones, literally none of this matters for you, right? Yes, calcium is important from a general health standpoint, but like none of this matters at all. So of course, we always want to be looking at the type of kidney stone that you have, and arguably even more important, your 24-hour urine test to know what is driving your stone formation. Both of those things are equally important depending on the situation, right? They're both are critical to really come up with an effective kidney stone plan that is actually going to work for you. And I really think that, and I talk about this in my free webinar. If you haven't joined me there, definitely do. If you head to kidneystoneclass.com, I have a free webinar. I really kind of walk through sort of my 3 steps to coming up with this personalized plan. And I truly think that one of the biggest benefits of coming up with this personalized plan is that you know what's really going to be most important for you, right? When we talk about kidney stone nutrition, there are so many different aspects to it, right? We talk about protein and fluid and calcium and sodium and sugar, right? So many different things. It is impossible for humans to do all of that at once. That's proven by research, right? Especially in the long term. We can all do anything for a short amount of time. That's fine. But kidney stone prevention is a long-term game. And when you know exactly what matters most for you, and you have just one or two, maybe three things that you need to focus on, you're going to be able to do those things a whole lot better. And your life is going to be a whole lot less stressful than if you're trying to do the 80 gazillion things that we talk about for kidney stone nutrition, right? It just makes sense, right? I just want to make this as easy for you as possible. I want you to get the biggest bang for your buck. I want you to know exactly what is causing stones for you, and we only know that from a 24-hour urine test. And from there, we can come up with a personalized plan that is really going to prevent stones for you. For many people, it does involve this calcium thing, since we know that calcium stones are obviously by far the most common type of stone. This episode and talking about getting in calcium is really relevant for the vast majority of listeners today. However, I always want to give that caveat that it's not true for everyone, and it's not important for everyone. And I really hate this notion of everyone with kidney stones should be doing the same thing, because that simply is not true, right? Even people who have the exact same type of stone, say calcium oxalate, can have totally different reasons why they're forming that stone. And so obviously what we are going to have them do to prevent their stones is also going to be totally different. It's so different. People, surprise, surprise, are complicated, right? Humans are complicated. There's lots of different stuff that can be going on, and kidney stone prevention is no different, right? So hopefully that helps. Like I said, I've gotten this question, I think literally this week 4 times alone, and it is only Tuesday. So it's just so common, right? We learn like, all right, I need to get in my calcium. How much calcium do I need to eat? And I don't know, but I do know we want to get in your daily total of 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams per day, ideally with your meals. We don't need to be thinking about how much oxalate is in this, because we honestly don't know anyway, and exactly how much calcium we should eat. Like that's way too complicated. Eat a serving of dairy or dairy equivalent, some other good source of calcium with your meals. And like I said, it's pretty much guaranteed you'll get into that 1,000 to 1,200 milligrams a day most of the time. Also, I know whenever I talk about this, people are like, what if I don't drink milk? That's totally cool. Yes, dairy is always my first sort of line recommendation, because dairy is just one of the few really naturally high occurring sources of stones, and we know very strongly that people who consume more dairy have a low risk of stones. However, you can totally get in that calcium in other ways, and I will link to my blog post that kind of outlines all those different ways for those people who cannot or choose not to drink dairy for a wide variety of reasons, and that's totally cool too. So with that, I will close this episode of the Eat Away Kidney Stones podcast. As always, if you have a question that you would like to be answered, please, I'd love to hear from you. Head to kidneystonepodcast.com for a chance for that question to be answered on the podcast. And I will see you again next Wednesday. Thank you for listening to today's episode. For more help with kidney stones, check out my website, www.thekidneydietitian.org. For more personalized help from me, check out my online course, Kidney Stone Nutrition School. VIP enrollment includes help directly from me. I can't wait to see you there and help you prevent kidney stones. Have a great day.